Hello and welcome to the third video of this channel. Today we're going to be finishing up the mission that we started in the previous video by launching this spacecraft into low Kerbal orbit on board one of my reusable boosters. This spacecraft is destined for the surface of Duna, and hopefully it will be able to make it there and back to the surface of Kerbal in one piece, while keeping all of the Kerbals on the inside alive. That is the dream. Before we go, I thought it might be worth fixing this solar panel. However, I remembered that engineers cannot fix solar panels. So, with this embarrassing little spacewalk of shame back to the pod, I can begin talking about the appropriate transfer window between Kerbal and Duna. Here is a time-lapse of the waiting that I did prior to the previous launch. You can see that Kerbal is moving faster than Duna, so we have to wait for it to come around and get 45 degrees behind Duna. That's going to happen just about now. Duna's transfer window, along with Eve's transfer window, are among the most infrequent transfers of the game, and the reason for this is because they have relatively similar orbital velocities. So if you want to do an entire revolution relative to Duna or Eve, it's going to take more than a year, because Duna and Eve are both running away or towards Kerbal. Compare this to one of the outer planets, which is moving practically not at all in comparison to Kerbal, and the most you're going to end up waiting for a transfer window is 1 year at the very greatest. Similarly, Moho there in the middle moves around much faster than Kerbal, so really you're going to only have to wait for Moho to go around once or twice, and that happens very quickly relative to a Kerbal year. I'm going to talk more about transfer windows and transfer angles in just a little bit, but right now I want to focus on this maneuver I'm setting up. You can see that I'm having some trouble getting an encounter with Duna, and this is because my transfer angle is not quite perfect. The way that you make up for this is by giving yourself a component of radial in or radial out in your escape velocity. By doing this, you change the time it takes to get to your apoapsis just slightly, and that is enough to mitigate the error from the transfer angle. And you can see there that by moving it inward, I've gotten the nodes slightly closer together, and I can pull back my burn there so that the orbit matches Duna's, and sure enough, we have an encounter with Duna. I do want to be clear here. You should not attempt to change your radial component of escape trajectory velocity by messing with the radial components on the maneuver node. These are going to change your velocity by almost zero, because the primary velocity direction that you're burning to get out of Kerbal is prograde, and so giving yourself even 100 meters per second in the radial directions are hardly changing anything. Instead, you should simply change the location of your burn. You saw that I was moving the node around my orbit such that the escape trajectory was pointing off in the inward direction, misaligned with Kerbal's direction of travel. You can see this here. As I zoom out, you can see that our escape trajectory is off by about 30 degrees inward of Kerbal's direction of travel. And naturally, this comes with great efficiency losses, which is why it's extremely beneficial to have a perfect transfer window. You can see that the burn that we're going to be doing is just under 1200 meters per second, and this is no doubt much larger than it would be if the trajectory were directly in line with Kerbal's prograde. You may also have noticed that I was making minute adjustments to the maneuver node in order to bring our encounter with Duna from a far flyby to a close approach. However, this is likely not going to be the final trajectory, and that is because I'm using this high-thrust mainsail engine on this kicker stage. And that is because this is a very heavy spacecraft, and I do not want to rip my hair out by waiting for several minutes for a low-thrust, high-efficiency engine to do the same burn. And we have enough delta V, at least we should, so there's no reason to mess around with more efficient engines. If I were taking this spacecraft somewhere different, I might play around with it, but it certainly would take much longer to do the burn. The reason that we're not going to be able to get the trajectory that we set up in the maneuver node is because those final bits of delta V that I was implementing in those various directions are extremely small in comparison to the overall magnitude of the velocity vector, meaning that they're extremely sensitive to any changes in overall velocity, and this engine is simply not sensitive enough to implement those fine changes. In fact, this sensitivity manifests itself in a number of different ways in KSP. There are a few minute krakens that can change your trajectory, especially all the way at Duna, by simply time warping or transferring from one sphere of influence into another. The game is not perfect, and when it does these things, sometimes your trajectory is changed drastically, and so it's very important to keep track of that and to not trust too closely in your original maneuver. It has happened to me before, where you warp all the way to periapsis at your destination from your trajectory here, and then you end up smashing into Duna because your trajectory has changed in the time warp or through the transfer of the spheres of influence. This is why it's always a good idea to make sure to do some corrective burns and never to warp straight to periapsis at any body unless you're absolutely 100% certain that you're not going to smash into it. With that said, we are getting near the end of this burn here, and you can see that our apoapsis is about to kiss Duna's orbit, which means we should be getting our encounter. And throttling down, we have just about completed the burn. I'm going to decrease the thrust limiter to do these last little pieces in an attempt to finesse the orbit, and I'm going to zoom in on Duna and look for my trajectory, which should pop up here in just a moment if I've done everything correctly. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to get the encounter straight from Kerbal orbit, so it's time to start planning ahead and get ready to do the first corrective burn to make sure that we encounter Duna. So, I'm going to zoom out here and place a maneuver node right there at the line of nodes, and that is the descending node. It is convenient, although it's not always the case, to have your semi-major axis, that is the line between your periapsis and your apoapsis, in line with the ascending and descending node. This is because you are going to be coming into contact with Duna at your apoapsis, and the point where your orbits intersect is the line of nodes. So if your transfer is configured in this way, you don't need to worry about inclination differences between your orbit and the destination orbit, which can definitely save you delta V because inclination changes are amongst the most expensive burns you can do. And we've just waved goodbye to Kerbal there as we make our way to the first corrective burn. During this burn, we are simply going to get our approach close to Duna, and then we're going to do a second corrective burn once we are closer to Duna. In the meantime, I'm going to talk a little bit more about transfer angles and why they're so important. In order to encounter a planet like Duna, you have to make sure that you get to where it's going to be at the same time that it does. And this means that the time it takes for you to travel from your periapsis to apoapsis of your transfer orbit must be the same as the time it takes for the receiving planet to move from its initial location when you do your first burn to its final location where you intend to meet it. Now, the rate at which things orbit around a star like Kerbal here are independent of their mass. So the transfer angle depends only on the radius of the initial orbit and the final orbit. If you want to, you can do the math. It's not too hard. However, luckily for me and everybody else, you don't have to. If you simply Google KSP transfer angles, you can find a number of online tools and databases which have either easy ways to compute or listed transfer angles for all of the bodies in the Kerbal system. If you don't get the transfer angle just right, then when you get to apoapsis and you're all ready to be captured by your receiving body, it's going to be thousands and thousands of kilometers either ahead or behind you. And this is going to cause you quite a lot of headaches, especially if you don't realize this until you're already at apoapsis. Another important factor into this equation is the sphere of influence of the receiving body, which you've heard me mention at least a few times in this video. The sphere of influence is essentially the catcher's mitt for your spacecraft. The larger the sphere of influence, the easier it's going to be to capture, because in terms of KSP, all that you really need to know about spheres of influence is that it is an area surrounding the body, and if you enter this area, you have an encounter. And it's fun to note that this is essentially how spheres of influence work in real life, at least with the basic orbital math that people use to go on interplanet trajectories. The scientific definition of a sphere of influence is where the gravitational effect of the body is no longer the dominating force on the spacecraft. The sphere of influence of a body is determined by its mass, the mass of whatever it's orbiting, and the distance at which it orbits. So the farther out you go and the more massive you are, the larger your sphere of influence is going to be. And the way that interplanetary trajectories and delta V budgets are computed in real life is with a method called patched conics. And if you've messed around in the settings of KSP, this phrase will be familiar to you. And it is essentially what KSP does, wherein once you reach the edge of the sphere of influence, It simply takes your velocity and inputs it into that new system. So you are essentially going from one body to the next seamlessly. Patched conics are also the underlying methodology of gravity assists. As you leave the sphere of influence of a body, you must add that body's velocity to your own in order to figure out how fast you're going relative to whatever your new system is. So for example, if you encounter the Mun and you are falling towards it and then eject in the prograde direction of the Mun's velocity is added to your own and you get a delta V benefit. It is pushing you out more, as though you had a little bit of a prograde burn relative to Kerbin. Similarly, if you're falling towards the Mun and eject in the retrograde direction of the Mun, its velocity is subtracted from your own, and that is a gravity assist in the retrograde direction. Patched conics is an extremely interesting topic, and I don't have the time to go into the nitty-gritty of how the math and the physics all works in this video, but I would love to discuss it more in a future video, and with some helpful graphics that will be much more beneficial to your understanding than my simple narration. But that is for the best, because we have just completed the second corrective burn and are now ready to encounter Duna. You can see that I've configured it there so that the periapsis is going to be just above 50 kilometers, which is where Duna's atmosphere begins. And now we've entered Duna's sphere of influence and are ready to come in. And you can see that I'm going to warp just before the periapsis there. I don't want to warp all the way to periapsis because I'm still nervous about crashing into things, as every good KSP player should be. Once we get there, I'm going to use the remaining fuel in this kicker stage to capture us in Duna's orbit. Another methodology for capturing yourself at Duna is an aerobraking maneuver, but these are always extremely terrifying to me, so I've elected not to do that. However, another body like Eve is the perfect candidate for an aero capture. This is because Eve is extremely heavy, and so its orbital velocities are very great, and your capture burn is also going to be very great. So an aerobraking maneuver can save you lots and lots of delta V, and because Eve is so heavy, it is especially beneficial to save delta V on an Eve mission. For the sake of time, I'm going to speed up the footage from now until we are getting ready to land. And while you're watching this sped up footage, I'm going to talk a little bit about why Duna is such an annoying planet to land on. The developers have done an extremely good job of making Duna very similar to real-life Mars, and Mars is also extremely annoying to land on. The reason for this is it is just heavy enough to make propulsive landing extremely expensive, and its atmosphere is just thin enough to make atmospheric landings, like using parachutes, extremely ineffective. It also makes the slowing of atmospheric entry extremely ineffective. So you can find yourself getting closer and closer to the ground, moving extremely fast, not getting any help from the atmosphere, and fighting a relatively strong pull of gravity. Despite that, Duna is significantly lighter than Kerbin, so it is going to be easier to get into orbit of Duna than Kerbin, but the atmosphere is going to play an extremely annoying role. With those two things in mind, it's time to begin the process of landing on Duna. Just a moment ago we executed the entry burn and lowered the periapsis to about 15 kilometers above the surface. Also, I went down to a flag on the surface and waited about half a Duna day to make sure that this particular hemisphere is the one that we're going to be landing on. The opposite hemisphere is loaded with huge canyons and several large mountains, which make it extremely hard to find a nice flat landing space. This side here, though, as you can see, is much flatter, much more calm, and will provide a much happier landing site. I'm going to speed up this footage until we are getting ready to do the most interesting bits of landing. And here we are, getting very low now, just under 5 kilometers above the surface, and still moving almost entirely horizontally. Our velocity has slowed by about half from when we were in orbit, and you can see our shadow and some rocks on the ground there as we are getting ever closer. And now we have started the landing burn with the kicker stage, and we'll separate it in a brief moment and deploy our chutes to help us float gently to the surface, but we will need to do an additional landing burn because we will be coming down at about 20 meters per second even with all of these parachutes. Now we can deploy the chutes, and we've separated the kicker stage. We can switch to this stage and watch what our fate would have been if we had failed to deploy the parachutes, which can sometimes happen if you're moving too fast for them to deploy. That is not a happy fate. Switching back to the main craft, we need to extend the landing gear and get ready to conduct the landing burn. And here we go, we're firing up the Wolfhound and lowering our speed to a more reasonable landing speed of about 7 or 6 meters per second. And even with that was a little too much, and we've bounced because of Duna's low gravity. And despite the horrible ugliness of this landing, I've heard it said that any landing that you can walk away from is a good landing. And so after a few hops, we will come to rest and will have successfully delivered Valentina and her 18 friends to the surface of Duna. Of course, the RCS and the parachutes are helping us here. I've set the indicator to radial out to help push the spacecraft upward. This spacecraft could definitely benefit from some wider landing legs, but it is doing the trick. And we come to a final stop. Now that we're here and landed, it's time for Valentina and her friends to get out of the spacecraft to explore the red plains of Duna. I'm going to spare you the footage of me getting 10 Kerbals out of a spacecraft and lined up in a nice pretty formation. I'm just happy that the tourists cannot exit the spacecraft, otherwise I would have had to do it 7 or 8 more times. And pausing for one final glorious look at these brave Kerbals and their spaceship, it's almost time to get back into the spacecraft and then wait for the return transfer window. Unfortunately, they cannot go straight home. We must wait for Kerbin to come into the proper position. So I'm going to again speed up the footage to get them back in and do the waiting. The transfer angle for Kerbin and Duna on the return trip is negative 75 degrees. That means that Kerbin must be 75 degrees behind Duna. So we're going to wait for that to be the case, and then we can begin our ascent to orbit and our kick into interplanetary space. And here we are. Kerbin is 75 degrees behind Duna, and we are ready to go. I'm going to take one final look at the spacecraft before retracting the solar panel and beginning our ascent. I'm going to speed this footage up also by 5 times for the sake of time, though it is important to keep in mind that if you want to get into orbit of Duna most efficiently, you must get above the atmosphere. It is annoying, and it is only thick very near the surface, so you really want to get your apoapsis high before you start your gravity turn, otherwise you're going to be fighting this atmosphere for a very long time, despite the fact that the low gravity makes it very tempting to turn horizontal very quickly. And here we are. We can see Ike rising above the surface as we are finishing our insertion right here, and you can see that we've just about expended all the fuel in this tank, so it's a very good thing that we did not attempt to use it for landing. Including these parachutes on this mission seems to have been a very critical aspect. But now that we're here, it's time to begin the thought process of returning to Kerbin. And this is extremely similar to the process of leaving for Duna, with only one major difference. As we set up our escape trajectory here, we want to line it up in the retrograde direction of Duna, as opposed to the prograde one that we used when we were leaving Kerbin. By doing this, you can see that we lower our orbit instead of expand it, and we need to lower it until our periapsis kisses Kerbin's orbit. Again, the transfer window is not exactly right, so we're going to have to use some radial components to make sure that we can get this encounter. But once we do, it will be very smooth sailing back to Kerbin. And for that reason, I'm also going to speed up this footage because this video just keeps getting longer and longer. With the maneuver configured and arriving in just a few moments here, it's time to begin the burn. An interesting feature that has been added in this most recent update of KSP is a visualization of your delta V limits. You can see on the maneuver meter there a thin black line that is going to mark where our current stage is going to cut out, and there it did, just where the line predicted. Now we can separate. I'm going to attempt to move these parachutes out of the staging sequence and activate just the engines, but of course the staging sequence is terrible, and so I've jettisoned the fairing that was only meant to be jettisoned right before landing, and activated all the parachutes. What's even more insulting is that it didn't even activate the engines, so I'm going to go ahead and do that manually to complete the burn. As I mentioned, there's not much new to see here. This is all very similar to the process of getting to Duna. But you can see that we've lowered our orbit such that it is touching Kerbin's and gotten an encounter. Now we're just warping until we have met with Kerbin, and as we arrive, you can see in the distance there that we are approaching the pale blue dot, and we're going to go ahead and warp closer, but not all the way to periapsis. And this time, this is more than just to satisfy my fears of crashing into things. This is also so that we can lower our periapsis into an appropriate entry altitude. Unfortunately, we are coming around into the night side of Kerbin, so if we do get fully captured, we will be landing on the night side of Kerbin. I did attempt to make this simply an aero capture, but I did go slightly too deep into the atmosphere, so we will be landing on the night side of Kerbin. Despite my successes at landing things at the Kerbal Space Center, I've yet to figure out how to land something at the Kerbal Space Center from an interplanetary trajectory. Regardless, we can simply hope that we land somewhere that is nice and flat and safe, and you can see that our orbit is being whittled down and we are officially being captured. The heat shield is holding up nicely, and there go the chutes for a second time, which were repacked by an engineer on the surface of Duna. As we get close to the ground, I can attempt a soft touchdown, but these engines are significantly smaller than they need to be, and we were also going extremely slowly, so they did not make much of a difference. And we can warp around to the morning so that we can see the craft in its entirety with its single broken solar panel and its exposed innards. We did land with about 200 meters per second of delta V, which is certainly a healthy surplus, which means that there was definitely some room for more errors than already occurred, which is always a good feeling. And we can have Valentina exit the craft, get some last-minute science before recovering the vessel, and sending all of these Kerbals safely back to their homes. Despite not having any scientific equipment on board, we did collect about 260 science from Valentina's valiant efforts, and we recovered 19 Kerbals, which is good and comforting because that is the same number of Kerbals who left with us in the beginning. It is also worth noting that we made about 600,000 funds from those tourists, despite the fact that I don't think we completed any of the entire group missions. That just goes to show that people will pay a lot of money for a trip to Duna. And that concludes this mission to Duna and back. I'm going to leave you with some graceful footage of the Kerbinauts exiting the spacecraft. I hope you learned something new about either physics or KSP, and if not, I hope you enjoyed listening to me talk about the things that you already know. I apologize that there is no big exciting things going on in this mission, but every once in a while you do have to finish the missions that you launch on cool rockets. And with that in mind, I thank you again for watching. I encourage you to leave any questions, comments, or recommendations in the comments section below, and I will see you again.